Hello and welcome to the inaugural episode of the C-Suite Cyber Podcast. The C-Suite Cyber Podcast enables C-Suite executives to make security-informed decisions.
All right, so I guess let's go ahead and introduce ourselves since this is the first time people are meeting us. So I'll go ahead and go first. So name's Michael, and I do security stuff. So I like to play both sides of the proverbial cybersecurity coin, the blue and the red side. So I get a little forensics and malware analysis, but also like to write the malware and play around with that as well. AJ.
Yeah, so primarily, I guess first off, my name is Anthony, or AJ. Primarily, I focus on the blue side and finding gaps, threat hunting, a little bit of detection engineering, and running down different ways to solve an issue that might exist that hasn't been addressed before by combining different log sources with Mike, and several times we're able to create creative solutions.
Cool. Yeah, with our powers combined, we bring you this podcast. All right, so we'll go ahead and do our sponsor for this first podcast. So this episode was brought to you by our penetration testing partner, Tandem Cyber Solutions. With most penetration testing firms, companies see them maybe once, maybe twice a year, depending on the actual security program. But networks are always changing. There are always new vendors being enrolled, new configurations, new technology. It's never static. It just isn't. And so that's why Tandem's different. With their hacker-powered security program, you have access to world-class hackers all year round, not just during the pen tests themselves. And this helps ensure that your network is always fortified. So what's better than using hackers to defend against hackers? For more information about their security program, about their penetration testing services, visit them at tandemcybersolutions.com/C-suite-cyber. All right. What's going on today, Anthony?
So today we're actually going to discuss a recent ransomware attack that hit the port of Seattle, performed by Reseda, and general guidance around ransomware. So in this particular case, seems like they got into the port of Seattle, which impacted SeaTac Airport as well, grounded a bunch of planes and ships, and it's actually by a group that I'm not too familiar with, Mike.
Yeah, they're not as prevalent as a lot of those other groups like Play, like Lockbit, like some of those other ones that we see a ton. They're just not out there wrecking shop like a bunch of these other folks. Funny story was as I was actually going through Seattle while they were rebuilding their networks and getting a handle on this stuff.
But that was fun.
Yeah, my dad was like, yo, they got some kind of security event going on. What's it look like over there?
And that was shortly after CrowdStrike's issue, right?
Yeah, so I think that was about a month maybe after all the CrowdStrike stuff. So they had a tough time at that airport.
Yeah, it's got to be pretty scary for travelers who don't necessarily face cybersecurity issues day to day. Just seeing
Yeah, I mean, you look at it now. I mean, it's already bad enough with all the delays, missing flights, and it's bad enough you throw the cyber attacks in there, and you're probably not going to make your flight.
Yeah. So I guess, Mike, let's first introduce ransomware, what it is, why it's become such a prevalent attack vector in really, I guess, the last decade, and why companies, and especially the C-suite level, needs to care about ransomware.
Yeah, so ransomware just at its base is a piece of malware similar to a virus, what we would traditionally call it a virus back in the day. Well, ransomware is a variation, just generally we call it malware. And what it does is it gets into the network just like any other piece of malware. And what it's going to do is it's going to start encrypting files on the system and hold them ransom, just like you may see like a cartel still take somebody hostage, holds them for ransom, same concept, except with data. So that's kind of the base form. And it gets amplified because what ends up happening is these pieces of malicious software spread across the network as fast as they can go and encrypt data on as many systems as they can get to. And if you think about that, that's where it becomes problematic.
So how do they move through the network then? Are they typically compromising domain admin and just using that one account to spray everywhere else? Or is it typically some type of exploit that is, or vulnerability that is being exploited?
Yeah, so it depends. It depends on the sophistication of the ransomware group, actually. So some of them just use pretty common techniques that a pen tester would use to move laterally. So they have a set of credentials, they see where they can get to, so a username and password. They're on a system as let's say they phished a user. They got them to execute a piece of malware, some malicious code. It runs, it's now running as that user. And so now they can check on that network to see what all that user has access to and start spreading wherever that access takes them. So that's a pretty standard way it would do that. Every once in a while, you'll see them do what we call hands-on keyboard. That means there's actually a bad guy there sitting behind the keyboard attacking, just like you would see a pen tester. Again, a pen tester sitting there working their way. It's not automated. So a lot of times as practitioners, we think of ransomware as an automated attack. You just run that code, it does its thing, it spreads the network, but that's not always the case. Sometimes there is actually someone doing that spreading.
Awesome. So what would be a good, just off the top, right? If you need credentials in order to move across the network, what is a good way that we can, as defenders, basically put a stop to that, or at least make it more difficult for them to get around?
Yeah, and we kind of look at these. I think we've had these conversations all the time. You look at this in terms of the maturity of the organization, right? Because depending on how far they are on their journey in cybersecurity, they may be at the point where they can take more drastic measures or more, I guess, more complicated measures to prevent themselves. But if we're talking about smaller companies, smaller organizations that don't really have an IT, like an huge in-house IT team, or even a security focused team, simple things such as limit the access all your users have, right? So if we go into, say, an insurance agency, your local insurance agency, for the most part, what you're going to see is that everyone has local administrator access. And what that means is when they run that piece of malicious code, that hacker, that ransomware now has local administrator access, which is bad news. They can do a lot with that. That's pretty bad, but that's like one of the first steps I always recommend. Make sure only your real administrators have that local administrator access. I would say that's probably one of the biggest things that I've seen. How about you?
Yeah, I've definitely been in a few organizations where it seems like everyone is a local admin, if not a domain admin. And when you discuss this with the one or two people who are security aligned in that organization, a lot of times the response is, "Oh, well, it was just easier for this," and then
Yeah.
they kind of set that and forget it. Taking a step back real quick, typically the ransomware operators are gaining access into the organization through email, correct?
Typically, yeah. In this case, that was not the case.
Oh,
This is different. Yeah, but typically that is exactly how we see a lot of breaches start, with social engineering of some sort.
and what are some good ways to basically embolden your own personnel against social engineering?
Yeah, so there's been this huge pushback, I think, lately against user awareness training, but I've always been a big advocate for it. They say it's useless, it's not really doing what everyone thinks it is. I disagree 100%. I've worked with a lot of clients and I've seen that huge change from not having any awareness training to having awareness training. And what you end up seeing is that I like to call it the spidey sense starts to build, where they're like, this seems weird. I remember this from my training. This is just odd. This person wouldn't generally do this. And what you're doing is you're building those instincts, and they do take time to build. And I would say that hands down, especially for small businesses, doing user awareness training is the most cost effective approach you can take, because they are your front line, right? That's your infantry of your company, is everyone that's interacting with clients, receiving emails every day. That's your front line. That is where you're going to stop the initial attack at the gate.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And, we've seen a big increase in phishes being reported and people actually going out of their way to make sure that they report something so that if it's not them, that they're also protecting their coworker who may have received a similar email. So that's a great
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point too, because a lot of them, they just send the same email when they're doing phishing campaigns.
Right.
It's not a unique email for everyone. That may change with AI, but traditionally it's the same email being just sprayed out there. And if you have a way to report those emails, you can report them as soon as they identify, yeah, this is a real phishing email. You can go ahead and get take all of those emails out of people's inboxes and reduce the chance that someone's actually going to click it and run something on the network.
Right. So getting back to Port of Seattle, how did they gain access if it wasn't through an email compromise?
Yeah, from my understanding, it was in, I don't know, it was through the VPN. So I don't know if they did an exploit. Ivanti was a big problem a while back. I did a big investigation this year with that VPN, but VPNs have actually been a huge target for quite some time now. I mean, you think about it, that's the quickest way inside the belly of the beast of any company, really. If you can get through the VPN into, and that drops you right into the internal network, that's half the battle. I mean, you're golden. So yeah, it's something to do with the VPN. So I don't know if it was exploit or they were able to get credentials. I can look real quick to see if any of these things specify any of these articles. There's, I mean, to be honest, there's not a ton of information. Seattle really hasn't released a ton of data, and I don't blame them.
Yeah.
I mean, the more information you release with things like this, the more you're giving other attackers, the less work they have to do to get in your organization. So I don't blame them.
Yeah. That's totally fair. We can go ahead and discuss both. I think, obviously, if it was through an exploit, one of the easiest things to do is stay updated, stay aware of the vulnerabilities that are coming out from your vendor. Like you said, Avanti has been targeted several times this past year, similar to a few other VPN concentrators. And even if it was shared credentials, there's stuff that you can do around that too. So if you have a service provider, you have an MSP or an MSSP who is providing strictly security services, you can look at logins, look at geofencing the organization. Maybe they're accessing during, Russian or Chinese daytime frames compared to West Coast where Seattle is obviously located. So there's a few things that you can put in place there. What else do you got?
Yeah, I would say geofencing is one of the most often overlooked one. Sure, the attacker could hop on their own VPN and leverage that to get IP inside the US, but really, when you look at security and it's that whole traditional mindset of layered security, not there isn't going to be a single silver bullet out there that's going to just prevent absolutely every adversary out there. You're looking at basically throwing a bunch of roadblocks in their way. One, to deter less sophisticated adversaries, right? If you're increasing that barrier to entry for them, hey, we're pretty hardened, we're pretty mature. You really got to know your stuff to get in here. You're getting rid of a lot of the people that would be targeting you. One. Two, you're increasing the time it takes for them to be successful, which is giving you time to respond. You're also limiting the damage that they may cause when they do successfully breach because you have all these things that are just hindering their ability to progress the attack. So more security is always a good thing. Sometimes, most people say it just gets annoying. Okay, I get it sometimes, but that's the balance we play in the security world, I think. In terms of other things, updates are definitely a good thing. We saw where a couple years ago that didn't really help in SolarWinds. Not for a while. I think it was about 6 months worth of updates that were polluted with malicious code. But it does help for the most part. It is definitely a game changer. The faster you can update, the faster you can prevent that specific weakness from being targeted. Because most people don't know, right? I tell clients when I talk to them, whenever there is an exploit, so we call it a public proof of concept. What it is an example of code or how to specifically attack a vulnerability that's out there. And as soon as that's released, what people start doing is there are tools like Shodan where you can type in a specific type of technology you're looking for and just say, give me everything with this exact version. And then you just start attacking all of it. You use a tool that just targets all of it systematically. And so it's not, sometimes it's not a case of I'm targeting you specifically, Anthony. It's a case of you just happen to be in that pool of candidates when I was searching for somebody, the target of opportunity.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction because, a few years ago, mom and pop shops would be like, "Oh, no one wants to hack me. They don't even know I exist." Blah
Mm-hmm.
blah. Well, now, I mean, if you're on the internet, like you're connected, people are scanning you. You can create a new account, and even before a minute is up, if you create a new Microsoft account, there's attempted logins. Like it just does not make sense anymore. So definitely need to get out of that mindset and be aware that opportunities are rich. So if I'm looking for just a spray and pray attack against someone who has a specific vulnerability open, I might get a couple $100 out of it, a couple 100,000 maybe. That's good for me. I mean, I don't want to do it personally. I don't like jail, but as a threat actor, it makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say another one too. I think you mentioned it, MFA, having multi-factor authentication. Man, I don't know how many times I've done a pen test and that's how I get in. I just guess a password. I get a list of all the users. I check LinkedIn. I just check the internet. There's a bunch of public places where you can get a list of emails. I
Hmm.
just start guessing some passwords. There's very typical patterns that people use. It used to be like the season and then the year exclamation mark. That's still a thing. I promise.
Yeah.
It's still a thing. And then now I think data leaks have been so prevalent. You can go out there and look to see passwords that have been used by specific people, by that organization. And usually what I do and why I'm so successful, I'd say I'm close to a 50-50 rate of guessing a password every external engagement, which is very high. Me just guessing,
Hmm.
right? And it's because you can look and start seeing those patterns that people are using. And a lot of times people still get stuck in that trap of, I'm just going to increment this by one. So if it's like password one, all right, I have to change my password. All right, we'll use password two now. And that's what happens. And insert whatever word or whatever phrase you want in there, but that's what they do. And they just start incrementing it every year. And so I'll do that. I was like, okay, this has been breached, so I'll try it once. And now let me increment it and see if that increment works. Yep, works. I'm in. And then if there's no multi-factor, I'm in. End of story. In the problem, and one of the ones I see at this point is that a lot of people are using that business email as the multi-factor for other accounts. So once I get that email, I'm in. I'm into their password manager. I'm into accounting software. It sucks. I mean, that is the linchpin for a lot of stuff is that business email. And then of course, if you're a bad guy, you can start phishing from a legitimate account. And that becomes a problem in itself. And now that helps you kind of dig your dig into much more of the company much quicker instead of having a guess. Now I'm gonna just fish these people, launch some malicious code on their systems, or get a password, or whatever you want to do. Right? You name it. It's a lot easier when people trust you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up password managers because I should probably use one. I don't in my personal life.
You are like that old granny with the notebook that says my
No,
passwords.
no, no. But I think that's important to know as well, though, right? Even if you use a password manager, if you gain access to the account and that password is also the password to that, or if there is no MFA, like you mentioned, then you're still in. Like it doesn't matter that you use a password manager if there's no MFA, and I can just reset the password in the email that I have because I've compromised your account. But I do want to MFA can help with like VPNs and actually gaining access into the network. But once you're on the network, unless you're in a large organization, a lot of times I don't see applications hidden behind SSO. Well, that wouldn't help with MFA, but I don't see that high level of authentication being required in order to access business apps. Is there anything that people should be putting behind MFA on their internal network?
In so when I talk to clients about their security, I like to help them focus their dollars, right? I think if you talk to any CISO, they're going to tell you, "I wish I had more money." I don't think any of them are satisfied with the amount of money they have in their budget ever. And so you're really constrained with resources. and you have to plan with that in mind. And so what I'll have them do is talk me through what are the things that are key to operations? What are your revenue drivers? If this thing went down, could your business still run? Could you still generate revenue? If not, we probably need to look at spending more time securing that thing, which could include adding MFA to access whatever it is. If it's an application, especially administrators of that application, anything that is absolutely critical to operations and revenue generating activities, that should have a little bit more love in terms of security.
Bring that back to the ransomware discussion, right? If you don't know your crown jewels, right? Like what
Yeah.
drives your revenue, what drives your business, and where to put those security measures, if you do have added budget and you're able to buy different mechanisms such as like EDR, MDR, or something that's looking for persistence or whatever, right? If you don't have those things known, then you're kind of already behind the game because you don't know what actually matters to your business. And if that's the case, then it's real easy. Odds are you're not going to have security that is protecting other places as well.
Yeah. I would say that a lot of our clients we get at our business, they are in the early stages of their security program. And so those are conversations you have to have with them early on. You know, let's talk about risk. Let's talk about revenue. Let's talk about operations. Let's talk about budget here. These are things you need to have because without it, you're kind of just shooting in the dark. Sure, we can apply some general security practices. Yes, they're going to increase the level of security you have, but we're not reducing the risk as much as we could in terms of operations themselves. And that's what the goal should be for most security leaders, right? We need to keep business running. I mean, ask the airport, they probably lost a ton of money. All these airlines, they lost, I forgot what it was. It was millions and millions upon dollars in what, 2 days? It was crazy. And that's because operations were impacted,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what you need to prevent at the end of the day, hands down.
Yeah. And I think it's important too if we're discussing, adding a service or MFA. MFA is going to be the cheaper option.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, there's
that's
a lot of free options out there, and
right.
almost pretty much every I can't really think of a VPN that doesn't have it, but most things, even applications, just web applications, support MFA. It's such an easy add now, very minimal overhead, very low cost. It's a no-brainer in my book.
Yeah. I have been in organizations, and I'm sure you have as well, where some of the more senior individuals complain
Oh,
for having to use MFA.
yeah.
And there's, if they're in charge of the budget, they kind of get their way. And you have to have that risk accepted by them. And if something happens, hey, I told you this could be a possibility, and you said that you accepted the risk. So this is not on me. This is on you. Have a nice day.
Yeah, and that's a tough situation, really, to be in. You're like, I know better than this, but I can't convince you.
Hmm.
Um, but I think those days are slowly getting behind us, where we see these executives' heads. They're on the chopping block now. They're at a lot more risk. They're criminally, financially liable for some of these things we've seen. I can't remember what companies. There's
Uber.
one fairly recently. Was it Uber? Yeah, and now they're being held liable for these things.
Hmm.
That's crazy, right? Never before have we seen something like that. But I think it's going to make people in these positions start rethinking, well, their position on security and whose responsibility it is.
Yeah, I think it's a tough situation to be in if you're bringing something to the board and the board is basically telling you to ignore what your training says
Yeah,
and to basically do what they say. Just tough situation all around. But if,
yeah. I've seen some. Have you ever heard stories where they would just have their admin do all the training and stuff for them just so they wouldn't have to do it?
yeah,
Yeah. It's amazing.
let's take a small size business, right?
Yeah.
And they're coming to us as a customer and they want to know, they're worried about ransomware because they're in the manufacturing industry, we'll say. Okay, if their systems get compromised, they can't print their materials, they can't sell them, so they're at a hard stop. What are
Mhm.
we recommending to them to have in place?
Sure. So we're thinking about this. So minimal resources, not necessarily a sophisticated network. Um, so one of the things I would say, and I do see this a lot too, is limiting share access. So this is a big one. Sometimes I go into organizations when I do a pen test and it's just wide open. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I'm getting access to server backups. This year I got access to backup of a domain controller and I was able to get credentials out of that. But it's just a lot of you have, and this was the lowest account possible I could have had, and I had access to all this stuff. And it's just one of those things, right? Least privileges possible are needed, and that's really what I try to preach. So limiting the shares that are available, limiting who has access to what. That's step one. Typically in bigger organizations, we would say segment the network. But these smaller organizations they're probably not going to do that. They don't have the resources to manage that level of sophistication. So one, controlling access as well, just in general. We were talking about that earlier. Every account should not have a local admin. They should not be in administrator groups unless they really absolutely have to. So we want to limit not just the shares that are available, but because those will be targets of ransomware. If they can get access to the data, they will encrypt the data. But two, we want to limit the ability for them to spread. So if we can limit the privileges, so that's typically what we call them. So access, but also privileges, what can they do on the network, on the domain? If we can limit that to the minimal, that's going to limit the blast radius, right? If we use military terms, how far are they going to damage? So I would say those are the two heavy hitters there that are going to have the most effect. Minimal cost, minimal maintenance, minimal overhead, just in general. How about you? What other suggestions would you add in there?
Yeah, I think just going back to like a lower cost or less prohibitive cost to enter, right, would be user awareness training. And on top of that, have Proofpoint or some other type of email filtering and email
Mm-hmm.
security in general. Just knowing that traditionally that's where they're going to come from. Maybe my organization doesn't even use a VPN. Maybe it's all in house. And then going back to what you were saying about shares, we did one test where we got in to the organization and like you said, it was wide open. So had access to multiple sites, had access to all the data, passwords, customer info, all the things like instant objective ticks, right? Just going one by one. And we could have compromised the data. We could have also backups, could have deleted the backups, which I think is something that we kind of skipped over. We kind of didn't even mention backups
Yeah.
in
Well,
regards to
well, let's have a deeper dive on backups after this because that deserves a whole convert. We were talking about that earlier this week about just backups, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah. No, but just in general, I think those are good targets, and it's important to know too if you're listening to this conversation, you're like, oh man, I don't have user awareness training for my associates. I don't have really someone that I could ask. If someone asks me if we have open shares or if we have freelance configured or something, I just wouldn't know that information. There's multiple options for things, just like there's multiple options for security products. And I think that's why it's great that Tandem is offering the consulting, like hacker security hours, so that you could ask people, and it's not going to be like an arm and a leg. You can ask people who
Yeah.
actively exploit these things and who do this in different size organizations and get the feedback that you need that can help you make the biggest impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I try when I do pen test, right? I try to we have conversations and it is a partnership. That's what we build with our client base. So you'll sometimes see like pen testers get in there. It's very adversarial, not just that they're doing something offensive, like
Hmm.
offensive security. That's what we generally call it. But when they get in there in that debriefing, you have the service providers in there, your IT admins, whoever executive, but it becomes very adversarial, right? Me versus you. And that's a bad place to be in, right? Because you need all these people to have a good security program, hands down, and you need them to get along. They need to be able to communicate with each other what their perspective is, right? So you have your IT folks And they're just like, I'm just trying to get this stuff to work. So this is my perspective. You have your executives. I'm just trying to keep the money coming in the door, right? And you have the security people. I'm just trying to keep the bad guys out of here. So somewhere in the mix of that, you have the right mindset. So, it's a mix. None of those should be like the ruling voice, right? It should be a mix of that to ensure that operations are running as low risk, but at as low risk as possible with as low impediment on operations as possible with low risk moving forward. So it's just a mix. It's just a mix of all those kind of forces fighting out in a nice way.
Yeah, some
Yeah.
people might call that a risk appetite.
Yeah,
Um,
could have a risk appetite.
and going back to what you were saying about it being adversarial, you know, that's
I know you've seen that before where they're just like, yeah, I found this thing, you suck.
yeah, and it's one of the shifts that I've had to do as I've started consulting and going into smaller organizations is thinking about the business, right? Thinking about the
Mhm.
revenue because I come from the Air Force. Sure, I come from like protecting against nation state actors, right? Working at a bank, like protect the money. So
Mhm.
I've always seen it from that lens, from the security lens and protecting the data and not necessarily keeping the business functioning. And when you change, I mean, think about it like that, right? When you think about the CISO or CEO, in some cases, is responsible for feeding these people and their families, right?
Yeah.
So, like, that is a huge burden. So, you have to come together and find that sweet spot where everyone is kind of in alignment with what they're willing to accept or potentially accept if it does happen. And I think that's something that a lot of people at smaller levels probably don't discuss. And not to switch gears too fast, but I think that's something that is also misunderstood in the SMB to medium sized businesses is I hired this organization for management so they provide security to me, and a lot of times that's not the case, and the company, the customer, just doesn't actually know, right? So they think, oh, I'm covered because they have their stuff on my boxes. Well, what happens if they get compromised, or what if they just tell you they do something and it's not actually what is being set in your own organization?
Yeah, it's been coming up more and more. I think we had a conversation recently about that where you have these service providers that are getting breached, and because they just have such crazy access to their clients, and not just one client, but like a bunch of clients, like 40, 50, whatever. Now, all of these are potential victims as well. It's just a huge domino effect. And it's really tough. And I will say the best security programs, big or small, companies big or small, are where they have really good at managing third party relationships, vendor relationships. I don't think there is a single company out there without at least a handful of vendors they work with,
Mm-hmm.
because they can't there's no way you can afford to hire experts in everything that you need for a security program. It's just impossible. Not only that, but it's actually good practice to have third parties to do stuff like security testing, because their job's not on the line, right? If you have these people and inside your organization and their job's on the line, you got to have something that keeps them honest, right? They have incentive to overlook stuff, to ignore stuff. Not saying they would, but they do have incentive. And they may not be as thorough, or they could have just lost sight, right? What is it? Lose the tree for the forest, or whatever the saying is. Like, they're just blinded because they're in it all day. So they may have just overlooked something for the last year because, well, they know it's there. No one wanted to do anything about it. And so it's taken a third party to say, hey, this is bad. And they need that extra voice to facilitate change within the organization.
Yeah, and that's also a very big pet peeve of mine at large organizations where you say something over and over and nothing changes, and then PWG or Deloitte or one of the big four comes in, audits you, and they're like, "Oh, guys, this is a bad thing. We need to fix this."
Yeah. Well, if they're paying them a lot of money, they're like, okay, I guess we have to listen.
Yeah, Well, cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it happens. There was something else I was going to say. Another thing that we just didn't even touch on at all, that is such an easy fix for networks, is antivirus. I mean, and to be real honest, if you're thinking I have to purchase some leading EDR, some leading AV in order to be 100% protected, you're wrong. Just having it turned on is a huge game changer. What's funny is that I think this year or last year I started seeing it change, but for the longest, companies just wouldn't turn on AV on servers.
Hmm.
So you could just hit them up all day with exploits. You have maybe like a Windows 2008 server. You can run Eternal Blue or some SMB version 2 thing or whatever. And you could just use a Metasploit payload. So Metasploit's a open source framework that's really well signatured by security tools. And you wouldn't expect it to work without any customization whatsoever. But you could just run it, get your connection back to your command and control server. It's pretty wild. Yeah, zero. And a lot of times too, you hear that concern from small businesses that, oh, I think I need something because it's not working or it's not going to catch everything. I want to say the last time I looked at the difference in detection between the free Defender version versus something like, I'm trying to think, what's Norton, McAfee, Symantec, whatever, name it. What's another one? I don't know. I'm not going to try to remember any other one. So it's not that much. It's like 5 or 10% detection. And not all of them detect the same stuff. They all specialize in detecting certain things just because they're all made differently. But what's funny is that, yeah, Defender will detect some stuff. And for those of you who don't know, this is what's installed by default on every Windows operating system out there. And it's updated. With every update, it gets new signatures, and it will detect stuff. Now, you're probably wondering, well, how's it going to prevent ransomware? Because it's so sophisticated. Not always. A lot of times there's pieces in there that heavily signatured. That's the term we use for saying we've seen it tons and tons of time. And they have now written rules that can spot this thing, this certain functionality, maybe this feature, maybe this even word inside of this program, and just kill it. Just prevent it from running. And sometimes you'll see them using these old versions that have already been seen. They have already had detections built for them, and just having Defender will catch it. That's it. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of sophistication. Now, the newer ones, the ones that haven't been seen, you're not likely going to catch those. Most stuff isn't likely to catch those. I've been able to bypass antivirus and EDR myself with a little effort, but it's just another layer, that another level of difficulty for these adversaries to get to you. That's what we're introducing here.
Yeah,
And it's free, right?
right.
Why not?
Defender's free, and then there's some more protections if you're like an O365 customer. There's different tiers and stuff like that as well with Microsoft. I'm not a huge fan of how they do security. It's definitely a pay-to-play area for them, but they do have some good detections. And something else that we didn't discuss that organizations may want to look into and maybe a little more in the weeds are canaries. I know a few EDR vendors. EDR is endpoint detection and response. So that's basically software solution that has an agent deployed on your devices. And if something is detected in the D, it would detect, raise an alert, and then you could go and you or your service provider could go and perform response on that device, remove whatever file triggered a signature, or take other responsive actions such as deleting a registry key, the user, etc., etc. Some EDRs deploy canaries. I tested a EDR vendor who deployed canaries, and I encrypted their canaries many times over, and then had a call with them, and they said, "Oh, you can just delete those." And I was like, then why do you have them? But canaries can be very cool. You can get some free canaries as well, and they're not only for ransomware. They're basically, if you think back to like miners being in caves, they take a little canary bird in there with them, make sure if the bird's chirping, there's oxygen. and if it's not, run. So that's kind of the same situation here, right? You can have canaries, deploy them into your user folders and such, and if they get encrypted or if there's any modification to those, they should raise an alert. And then you can have other canaries that are basically used for deception scenarios. So canary tokens actually has updated recently. I was working with a client and showed them canary tokens, and they have way more options now. It's super cool. You can have spreadsheets. So if they're open, it'll grab the IP address, the username, not the username, IP address, and send you an email or whatever kind of notification saying, hey, this was open here. And so you can put those in sensitive areas. So if we're talking back to earlier in the discussion about your crown jewels or what drives your business, if you have sensitive files, you could toss a canary token in there. So if it ever gets open, you have an earlier indicator that, hey, something might be occurring, or maybe someone is just looking through files, they don't know what it is, or potentially you could have an insider threat as well. But it is an early warning indicator that can be beneficial.
Yeah, another one you didn't mention that can be used as a canary is we'll see, or at least I've seen, I think we may have talked about this as well at some point, canary accounts. So accounts that aren't actually used, but if someone were to breach your organization or to dump all your usernames and hashes or passwords and then attempt to use them, you have an indication that you had an actual breach because no one should be using that account for anything. So that's just another way to kind of get that early warning that something's happened. Well, not early, it's a little bit late. It's like the long tail. But at least you know that something really bad has happened because someone got to it and no one's using it and it's not anywhere else except in the network.
Yeah. I'm going to say early, I guess I'm so used to certain areas alerts taking forever to actually populate.
That's everywhere. I've worked in a lot of organizations that detection isn't as fast as you would like it to be.
Yeah.
And it is what it is. Part of the maturing process.
Right. I think that's something we should discuss later is the maturity framework and kind of aligning with risk and stuff there.
Yeah, we should definitely talk about, because there's a bunch of maturity frameworks, not to derail the current conversation, but yeah, we should definitely kind of chat about it. Because it is a journey. I look at cybersecurity as a journey. You're not going to just drop $10 million for a new, whole security stack as a smaller business. It's not happening. And I guess some big businesses won't even bat an eye at that. But for them, we'll say $100 million to $200 million to redo it, just to go from zero to hero. It's not happening. It's a steady progress. And you really don't know what you need until you know it, right? But when you're saying, all right, we can see this, we're analyzing our visibility, and we have a huge gap over here. We should probably buy something that gives us visibility here. Or our response isn't as fast as we would like, so we should probably figure out a way to smooth out that incident response process or that notification process, whatever it is. So it really is a journey of constantly kind of reevaluating where you are and what the top priority item is for your budget that year.
Yeah. Your security should never be in a stagnant place, that's for sure. There's new technologies, new exploits. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are being introduced and removed in networks all across the world. So odds are something will be exposed at one point or another.
Yeah. A lot of stuff is being built into. You were talking about detecting phishes and stuff like that. Google has a pretty solid detection capability in terms of phishing. Just in general, out of the box, you don't really have to do anything special. They do a really good job. Microsoft does pretty similar with Office 365. So they're really integrating a lot of these products, just like Defender. It's free, it's integrated. A lot of people just overlook these free things because they're free. Maybe they don't think they have as much value as something paid. But companies, especially those strapped for budget, for cash or whatever, there's a lot of free stuff, even open source tools out there that they can utilize to build up their security program with a limited budget. There's a lot of options these days. It's incredible.
Well, to recap, I did take some notes. Just wanted to hit them real quick. So some of the things that we mentioned that we think everyone should be implementing or should be researching into how to implement, starting off would be least privilege. The reason for that is to prevent lateral movement. We basically want to make it impossible or at least more difficult for an attacker to gain entry to your network and go from one account to another account or actually taking over your domain. Another thing we discussed was user awareness training, basically giving training to the employees of your organization, showing them different scenarios. Now you've got phishing, quishing with QR codes, which I hate QR
All
codes.
the issues. Go ahead. Let's hear them.
Phishing, voice, smishing, text. There's probably going to be another one for like deep fakes, FaceTiming you soon.
How about pagers? Is there one for pagers?
It's another discussion. Yeah, user awareness training. I've seen good results. Now it is important. Caveat this: the training needs to be good. It does not need to be the same old. I'm Air Force. Mike was Army. We've all seen the DoD, the bald guy asking you to put the thumb drive or CD into your computer.
What was his name? I can't remember. It's
I
like
don't
Sam or something like that.
Someone will tell us.
Yeah.
We've all seen bad training, right? And if it's bad, people aren't going to pay attention to it. It needs to not only show you what's going on, but also explain like how this could be bad. Another thing we discussed, geofencing. I am a big fan of geofencing. I try to tell everyone that can geofence to do it. Obviously, if you're a country-based organization, geofencing might not make sense, especially if you're in Europe. There's just so many countries that are very close together. Someone travels, takes a train or something, then all of a sudden they can't log in. That could also be detrimental. So be sure to do your research and actually understand what you're implementing and what the effects could be. MFA, huge one. Make your execs use it. That's always an easy way to gain access if there's no MFA. Share access. I haven't seen many shares open, but I guess shares can take different shapes and sizes. File shares compared to like SMB, and like on-prem shares that we would think of. But that is a big one. Easy for lateral movement, compromise of data. Also easy to collect if you set up like a SMB server to collect NTLM hashes. It's a fun old school one. Antivirus, FreeWorks, Defender. Just think about this. Microsoft has millions of devices worldwide. We all know Microsoft has bloatware. Defender, not necessarily bloatware, but does collect telemetry across all those devices. Microsoft has a ton of stuff, and then they signature it, push it back in as a detection. Now you have stuff because someone in another country opened something they shouldn't have, and now you're protected from that. Free definitely works.
I want to stop real quick and say I'm glad this is recorded because I think that is the only nice thing you'll ever say about Windows.
I don't think it was nice.
I think it was pretty nice. It was solid.
They're still spying on you, but it's there.
So Anthony hates Windows. He loves Macs. I love Windows because that's one of my specialties. So we agree to disagree with what we like here.
I like the Apple ecosystem, and I like Windows if I have to compromise something because I do not write code, and it is very easy to do so. Defender free version definitely works. If you're on Mac, do not think that Mac is 100% secure. That is definitely not true. Canaries can be fun.
Well, hang on. Just to step back real quick. I know we didn't talk about it, but just to add to the security software in Windows, there's a ton there. You have App Blocker that helps where you can allow list specific software that you should be using in the environment. That's one. You also have the ability to prevent scripts from executing. So execution policies with PowerShell. So there's a whole, like you said, the word ecosystem. There is a whole ecosystem in Windows that allows you to really, for free, it's built in, it's free. You just have to use it to really cut down on what a user can do on their system. I mean, if you have an administrator, personal admin, they shouldn't be running PowerShell scripts, right? They shouldn't have local administrator access. So you can limit this by the roles that people play in your organization. So I just wanted to stop and point that out. There's more than just Defender. There's a ton of stuff there. If you have a good IT guy or gal, have them plan out what they should be implementing across the board, across your entire enterprise or company, if it's a SMB company.
Yeah, good point. When I say ecosystem, I mean the ability to like pass stuff from iPhone to MacBook. But yeah, Windows ecosystem.
Windows has an ecosystem too, man. They have one.
Yeah, it's like a terrarium. And then canaries were the final thing we talked about. And canaries, like I said, that might be a little too in depth for some organizations. Can be useful, definitely not a requirement. And that's all of the topics that we hit on today. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to reach out to Tandem Cyber Solutions. Need help with something, feel free to use the Hacker Power Security Program. We're here to help you answer your questions, discuss different use cases that we might think of from the attacker perspective within your organization. A lot of times these ransomware groups will claim in their little ransom note that they are pen testers or security practitioners, and they're just better than your company's security. So we can help more so. Mike can help get that data in front of you before an external threat actor does. Mike, you got anything else?
Yeah, I want to point out this is our very first podcast for the show, but we will be putting out, we'll be on pretty much most social medias. Reach out there if you have a question. We'd be happy to have some of these CISOs on here to talk about the problems they're facing, have some questions. Yeah, this is definitely a forum for conversation. That's the whole point of this. We want to empower people to make good decisions, to talk through problems, to work together. We'll also be having subject matter experts come on here who can just help us dive into a specific topic that people just have a lot of questions about, whatever it happens to be. So we're definitely here. Definitely reach out if you have any questions. If you want us to talk about a specific topic, throw it out there. We'd be happy to chat about it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Mike said, you can find us on all these platforms that I'm about to sign up for, including LinkedIn. We'll have YouTube at some point, all the podcasting platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, etc., etc. And then we'll have some other social media accounts, X, and I feel like there's something else that I'm missing. We're
figuring this out. We're security nerds here, okay? We don't know how the social media stuff works. We're figuring it out as we go. If there's something we're not on, let us know. We'll hop on there too. Yep. Cool. All right, so I guess that's it for this show. Look for us for our next show. We're going to be doing every 2 weeks. Every week or two, we'll have a new episode out on the platform. So look at it. Look for us. Reach out, and we'll see you next time. Bye.